May 19, 1945. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Kittery, Maine. The leather notebook pressed against Luftwaffe General Ulrich Kessler's uniform jacket felt impossibly heavy, though it weighed less than a pound. He had been a passenger aboard U-234, one of the last German submarines to surrender, carrying uranium oxide and disassembled jet fighter components to Japan, when Germany's collapse forced them to turn themselves in to American forces instead. Now, as he stood on American soil for the first time as a prisoner, being processed through one of countless facilities that would interrogate the Third Reich's final military personnel, something caught his attention that made him forget, momentarily, his own precarious situation. Through the chain-link fence surrounding the submarine pen where U-234 now berthed, he counted 7 distinct vessels under construction or repair simultaneously. The scene stretched beyond his immediate sightline. 8 vessels, 9, 12. His eyes kept finding more. This was supposed to be a secondary American shipyard, not even one of their major facilities. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard handled submarine work, yes, but German intelligence had always classified it as a minor installation compared to the massive complexes at Brooklyn, Norfolk, or the sprawling Kaiser operations on the West Coast. Yet here, in this supposedly secondary yard, he witnessed concurrent activity that exceeded anything he had seen in Germany, even at the height of wartime mobilization. The mathematics were impossible. Germany's largest submarine facility at Kiel, operating at maximum wartime capacity with round-the-clock shifts, could service perhaps 3 boats simultaneously. The entire German U-boat construction program, at its absolute peak in 1943, had managed to complete just over 200 submarines in a full calendar year. Every one of those boats represented months of specialized labor, carefully rationed steel, and the coordinated output of hundreds of suppliers across occupied Europe. Kessler had visited Kiel twice during the war. He had seen the cramped efficiency, the way every square meter of dock space had been optimized, how workers moved in practiced choreography to minimize wasted motion. It was, by German engineering standards, a triumph of organization. This American yard operated at a scale that made Kiel look like a repair shop, and Portsmouth was not even building the massive fleet carriers and battleships that dominated American naval output. Those leviathans came from places like Newport News and New York Naval Shipyard, facilities that, according to captured Allied documents, operated on budgets exceeding the entire German naval construction appropriation for a full fiscal year. Kessler's training as a Luftwaffe General officer had given him a sophisticated understanding of production constraints. He knew that specialized machinery could not simply be conjured into existence, that skilled workers required years of training, that complex manufacturing depended on intricate supply chains taking decades to establish. These were not ideological talking points or propaganda narratives. These were engineering realities, the fundamental constraints that governed industrial warfare. For 5 years, German military planners had made calculations based on certain assumptions about American limitations. Yes, the United States possessed enormous raw potential. Germany knew this, but potential meant nothing without infrastructure to exploit it. You could not build ships without shipyards, and shipyards required years to construct. You could not weld hulls without trained workers, and training a competent shipyard welder took 18 months at minimum. The United States had entered the war with approximately 24 shipyards capable of handling major naval construction. Germany had assumed, based on sound industrial analysis, that this number represented a relatively fixed constraint. Yards could be expanded, yes, but only gradually. New facilities could be built, but only slowly. These were the iron laws of industrial development that every nation faced. But something had happened in America that violated these iron laws. Kessler had read the intelligence reports, though he had dismissed them as exaggeration or Allied deception. The reports claimed that America had built 18 entirely new major shipyards between 1940 and 1943, massive facilities constructed in months rather than years, equipped with machinery and trained workers at a pace that seemed to defy every principle of industrial development. The reports claimed that by 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day every day, with construction times that had fallen from 8 months to 6 weeks. The reports claimed that a single West Coast yard, operated by an industrialist named Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship before the war, had launched a completed cargo vessel just 10 days after laying its keel. German naval intelligence had analyzed these claims and concluded they were impossible. The numbers did not work. The logistics did not work. Even if America had unlimited steel and unlimited workers, the physical constraints of shipyard operation created absolute limits on output. You could not assemble a 10,000-ton vessel in 10 days. The welding alone would take weeks. The quality control would be impossible. The entire story had to be propaganda, designed to damage German morale and perhaps to intimidate neutral nations into siding with the Allies. Kessler had believed this analysis because it made sense, because it aligned with everything he understood about industrial warfare, because any other conclusion required believing that America had somehow transcended the normal rules of manufacturing. He was looking at proof that the intelligence reports had been, if anything, conservative. The yard before him operated on principles that seemed to defy German understanding. Multiple vessels moved through parallel production lines, each at a different stage of completion. Prefabricated sections, entire segments of hull and superstructure, arrived at the docks pre-assembled and were lifted into place by massive cranes that dwarfed anything Kessler had seen in German yards. Workers swarmed over the vessels in numbers that would have been considered wastefully excessive by German efficiency standards, yet their movements showed clear organization and purpose. The welding arcs blazed continuously, 3 shifts running without pause, the American industrial machine operating at a tempo that Germany had never achieved even during the most desperate phases of total war mobilization. And this was just one yard. This was Portsmouth, a secondary facility. The major shipbuilding centers would be operating at even greater scale. Kessler did some mental arithmetic. If, too, Portsmouth could handle a dozen vessels simultaneously, and if the major yards operated at 3 or 4 times Portsmouth's throughput, and if America had as many yards as the intelligence reports claimed, then the total American shipbuilding output would be not merely larger than Germany's but larger by an order of magnitude. The implications cascaded through his understanding of the war. Every strategic calculation that Germany had made, every plan that depended on attrition warfare and production rates, had been based on assumptions that were catastrophically wrong. The submarine war in the Atlantic had been premised on a simple equation. German U-boats would sink merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had calculated, based on careful analysis of British shipbuilding and convoy losses, that maintaining 300 operational U-boats could sever Britain's supply lines within 18 months. The mathematics had seemed sound. Britain could build ships, yes, but not fast enough to outpace the killing rate of a properly organized Wolfpack campaign. Even after America entered the war, German planners had assumed that American shipbuilding, while substantial, would still operate under the same constraints as British yards. More volume, certainly, but not infinitely more. Not enough to fundamentally change the equation. But what if American shipyards could build a merchant vessel in 6 weeks? What if they could launch 3 ships per day, every day, without pause? Then the equation reversed. Then every U-boat sunk represented not a temporary setback but a permanent loss of irreplaceable assets, while every merchant vessel sent to the bottom could be replaced within weeks. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Germany had believed it was winning as late as 1943, had in fact been mathematically lost before it began. The United States had been building ships faster than Germany could sink them from. The moment America entered the war, the entire U-boat campaign, which had cost Germany more than 30,000 trained submariners and more than 700 submarines, had been fighting against arithmetic that made victory impossible. Kessler watched an American work crew, perhaps 40 people, moving a massive hull section into position. The prefabricated segment must have weighed 50 tons, yet it settled into place within minutes, workers swarming over it immediately to begin welding it to the existing structure. In a German yard, that same operation would have required careful preparation, precise measurements, a full day's work by a specialist team. Here it happened as routine, one of dozens occurring simultaneously across the yard. The Americans had industrialized shipbuilding in the same way Henry Ford had industrialized automobile manufacturing, reducing complex construction to a series of standardized, repeatable operations that could be performed by workers with relatively brief training periods. German yards still built ships the traditional way, with skilled craftsmen performing custom work on each vessel. It was slower, more expensive, but it produced submarines of higher quality, or so German naval architects had insisted. But in industrial warfare, quality multiplied by quantity determined outcomes, and if the quality difference was modest while the quantity difference was enormous, then quantity won. A mediocre ship that existed was infinitely more valuable than a superior ship that had not yet been built. The Americans understood this in a way that Germany never had. They had designed the Liberty ship to be cheap and quick to build, not to be elegant. It was slow, ugly, powered by an obsolete engine design that no modern shipbuilder would have chosen. But it could carry 10,000 tons of supplies across an ocean, and America could build it in 6 weeks, and that was all that mattered. The British called them ugly ducklings. American shipyard workers called them worse. But those ugly, slow vessels had carried the supplies that fed Britain, equipped Russia, and supported the massive American military build-up that had crushed Germany's armies across 2 continents. Behind Kessler, an American Navy officer was conferring with 2 civilian officials, their conversation audible even at a distance because they made no attempt to lower their voices. Security around the German prisoners was strict, yes, but nobody seemed particularly concerned about what intelligence a captured Luftwaffe general might gather by looking at American shipyards. Why would they be concerned? The war in Europe had ended 12 days ago. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Whatever Kessler observed here was irrelevant to any German war effort because there was no German war effort anymore. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. The American officers were discussing production schedules for submarine construction in the latter half of 1945. Apparently, Portsmouth would be shifting toward specialized variants, since the primary submarine war in the Pacific was entering its final phase. The conversation was casual, matter-of-fact, the tone of men discussing routine business operations rather than military production. One officer mentioned that another yard on the Gulf Coast would be picking up the slack, and there was some good-natured joking about inter-yard competition and efficiency metrics. They were talking about submarine construction the way a factory supervisor might talk about furniture manufacturing. Building submarines, vessels that represented the pinnacle of German naval engineering and that required months of skilled labor and enormous investment, had become a routine industrial operation for the Americans, something to be managed with production quotas and efficiency targets. Kessler thought about the submarine program that had brought him here. U-234 had been a Type XB, a cargo-carrying variant designed for long-range transoceanic operations. The Kriegsmarine had built only 8 Type XB boats during the entire war. Each one had required specialized construction techniques, custom components, careful quality control. U-234 herself had taken nearly 2 years from keel laying to commissioning. She represented thousands of hours of engineering work, millions of Reichsmarks in investment, the coordinated output of dozens of suppliers and manufacturers. She was a triumph of German engineering, able to carry 252 tons of cargo from Europe to Japan without refueling, equipped with the latest acoustic torpedoes and radar detection equipment, crewed by hand-picked specialists. And America could have built her equivalent in 6 weeks. Not quite her equivalent, no. The American cargo submarines were different in design, optimized for different operational profiles, but they could carry similar tonnage, operate at similar ranges, and accomplish the same strategic missions. And where Germany had built 8 cargo submarines in 5 years, America had built dozens. Where Germany had agonized over every design choice, calculating trade-offs between cargo space and defensive armament, America had simply built multiple variants and tested them in operational conditions to see which worked best. German engineering was about achieving perfect solutions through careful analysis. American engineering was about achieving workable solutions through rapid iteration. The German approach produced technically superior individual vessels. The American approach produced functional vessels in overwhelming numbers. The scale of American production was not just quantitatively different from German production, but qualitatively different. Germany had industrialized in the late 19th century, building its manufacturing base on principles of precision engineering and skilled craftsmanship. German workers trained for years to develop expertise. German factories emphasized quality control and customization. This approach worked excellently for peacetime manufacturing, for producing machine tools and precision instruments and specialized equipment. It worked less well for industrial warfare, where the side that could produce adequate equipment in vast quantities held an insurmountable advantage over the side that could produce superior equipment in limited numbers. America had industrialized differently. American manufacturing had developed in an environment of abundant resources, vast distances, and chronic labor shortages. This had forced American producers to emphasize standardization, mass production, and mechanization in ways that European firms had not. American factories used more machines and fewer skilled workers. American products were more standardized and less customized. American manufacturing processes emphasized speed over perfection. In peacetime, this made American products somewhat inferior to their German equivalents. American machine tools were not as precise. American automobiles were not as well engineered. But in wartime, the American approach proved vastly superior because it scaled effortlessly to emergency production. When America entered the war in December of 1941, it had a small military and a modest defense sector. Germany had looked at American military production in 1941 and concluded that while America would eventually become a significant threat, it would take years for American factories to mobilize effectively. Germany had calculated that it would win the war in Europe before American production became decisive. This calculation was based on Germany's experience with its own mobilization, which had taken the better part of a decade to transform German manufacturing from peacetime to wartime operation. If America required similar time, if it took until 1945 or 1946 for American factories to reach full wartime output, then Germany would have already won in Europe. But America did not take 5 years to mobilize. By the end of 1942, just 12 months after entering the war, American war production exceeded all Axis production combined. By 1943, America was producing almost as much war material as Britain, Germany, and Russia combined. The speed of American mobilization was unprecedented in military history. German planners had assumed that mobilizing a large industrial economy was a slow process because that was what German experience showed. But American mobilization followed different rules because American manufacturing was structured differently. German factories needed to be retooled and reorganized for military production, a slow and complex process. American factories, already set up for standardized mass production, could be converted relatively quickly. German producers needed to train workers in specialized skills, which took time. American producers could use semi-skilled workers and specialized machinery to achieve similar outputs much faster. The Roosevelt administration had announced, in January of 1942, that America would build 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, and 55,000 anti-aircraft guns within 2 years. Hitler's military advisors had assured him this was propaganda, that no nation could possibly achieve such production targets. But America had exceeded these targets. By 1944, American factories had produced 300,000 aircraft. By the end of the war, American shipyards had built 5,500 major naval vessels and 2,700 Liberty ships. American factories had produced 88,000 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, and 2.4 million trucks. The material output of American manufacturing had exceeded the combined production of every other major combatant by a margin that made the entire conflict seem predetermined in retrospect. Kessler had been trained as an Air Force officer, and he understood aircraft production perhaps better than any other aspect of military manufacturing. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with the most sophisticated air force in the world, flying aircraft like the Me-109 and Ju-88 that were technically superior to anything the Allies possessed in 1939. German aircraft production had increased steadily throughout the war, reaching peak output of about 40,000 aircraft in 1944. This represented a tremendous achievement, accomplished despite constant Allied bombing and critical shortages of materials and fuel. 40,000 aircraft per year from a nation under siege represented the absolute limit of what could be achieved through organization and efficiency. America had produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944, not just 40,000 more than Germany, but more than double Germany's peak output. And American aircraft, which had been inferior to German designs in 1941, were equal or superior by 1944. The P-51 Mustang, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the F-6F Hellcat, these were superb machines, as good as or better than anything Germany flew, and America made them in quantities that overwhelmed the Luftwaffe through sheer numerical superiority. German pilots in the war's final year reported facing enemy aircraft in ratios of 10-1, 20-1, sometimes worse. The Luftwaffe had some of the best-trained pilots in the world, flying technically advanced aircraft, but skill and technology meant nothing when you were outnumbered 20-1 and the enemy could replace losses within weeks while you could not. The psychology of industrial warfare was as important as the material reality. German soldiers in the final year of the war had known they were losing. They saw American aircraft overhead in unprecedented numbers. They faced artillery barrages of overwhelming intensity. They encountered enemy forces equipped with new equipment arriving constantly, while German units struggled with aging equipment and dwindling supplies. This knowledge affected morale in ways impossible to measure but clearly decisive. German soldiers continued fighting with remarkable determination despite hopeless conditions, but their effectiveness declined as it became obvious that material superiority was insurmountable. Conversely, American and Allied soldiers fought with the confidence that came from knowing that their side possessed overwhelming advantage. If they lost a battle, they would be re-equipped and sent back. If they suffered casualties, replacements would arrive. The material abundance of American war production translated into psychological confidence that affected battlefield performance in countless small ways. Kessler reflected on his own experience over the past week. U-234 had been carrying materials to Japan that represented Germany's most advanced technology. Infrared fuses, Me-262 components, 560 kilograms of uranium oxide intended for Japanese atomic research. The boat had also carried Japanese officers who had been in Germany to observe German military developments and who were returning to Japan with plans and specifications for advanced weapons systems. When Germany surrendered, the U-boat's commander had faced a decision: continue to Japan and face probable interception by American naval forces, or surface and surrender. The Japanese officers aboard had committed suicide rather than be captured. The German crew had chosen to surrender. They had destroyed some of their most sensitive cargo, throwing the uranium oxide overboard, but they had been unable to destroy everything before American forces took control of the boat. But here was the disturbing realization: none of this information mattered. The sophisticated German technology aboard U-234, the weapons systems that Germany had spent years developing, were not sufficiently advanced to overcome America's production advantage. Even if Japan obtained these designs, even if Japanese engineers successfully replicated German technology, it would not change the outcome of the Pacific War because Japan faced the same insurmountable disadvantage. Japan could not match American production, and without matching American production, technical sophistication was irrelevant. The uranium oxide that had been thrown overboard would not have enabled Japan to build an atomic weapon quickly enough to matter, and even if it had, America's own atomic program was further advanced and better resourced. This was the lesson that Kessler understood, standing in a prisoner processing area in Maine, watching American workers swarm over submarine hulls in a secondary shipyard. The war had not been won by superior tactics, better soldiers, more sophisticated weapons, or ideological determination. It had been won by factories. America had built more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more trucks, more guns, more ammunition, more of everything than the Axis powers could destroy. The American military was not particularly well led in the early war years, and American equipment was often mediocre by German standards. But American production was so overwhelming that it compensated for every qualitative disadvantage. By 1944, American soldiers were as experienced as German soldiers, American equipment was as good as German equipment, and American numbers were vastly superior. And Germany had seen this coming. That was perhaps the most disturbing realization. This was not a surprise. German intelligence had reported on American production before America even entered the war. German military planners had known that America's industrial potential vastly exceeded Germany's. But Germany had told itself that American production would not matter, that the war would be decided before American mobilization could affect the outcome, that superior German military performance would overcome material disadvantages. These assumptions had all been wrong, catastrophically wrong. But they had been convenient assumptions that supported the war effort and justified continued fighting. Acknowledging that American manufacturing made German victory impossible would have required Germany to end the war years earlier. But Nazi ideology did not permit negotiated settlements or strategic retreats, and so Germany had continued fighting even after the material balance had made the outcome certain. The American officer finished his conversation and gestured to Kessler. Time to move along to the next processing station. Kessler took one last look at the shipyard, at the concurrent assembly operations, at the massive cranes positioning prefabricated sections, at the three-shift workflow that never stopped. This image would stay with him through the interrogations to come, through the prisoner of war camps, through whatever came after. This was what Germany had faced. Not better generalship or superior strategy, but production on a scale that made victory mathematically impossible. America had not merely won the war. It had built the largest industrial economy in human history, and then it had converted that economy into a war machine that produced military equipment faster than any opponent could possibly match. Germany had been fighting not against American soldiers, but against American factories. And American factories had proven to be the most decisive weapon of the entire conflict. In later years, when historians asked surviving German military leaders how they had failed to understand America's manufacturing strength, many would claim that the intelligence had been faulty, that the reports had been dismissed as propaganda, that nobody could have predicted such overwhelming production. But this was not quite accurate. The information had been available. The intelligence reports had been remarkably accurate. What Germany had lacked was not information, but the willingness to accept what the information meant. Accepting that American production made German victory impossible would have required fundamentally rethinking Germany's strategic position, and Nazi ideology made such rethinking impossible. Kessler walked toward the processing station, away from the shipyard, but the image remained fixed in his mind. 12 vessels under construction simultaneously in a secondary yard. 3 cargo ships launched per day across all American shipyards. 5,000 ships built in 4 years. Numbers that should have been impossible, but that represented simple fact, simple reality that Germany had refused to accept until it was far too late to matter. Germany had lost the war the moment American factories began operating at full capacity, and that moment had arrived sometime in early 1943. Everything after that had been inevitable, a slow playing out of mathematics that led inexorably to Germany's complete defeat. The war had been decided by men and women in factories, by welders and machinists and assembly line workers, by the people who built the ships and aircraft and tanks that military forces used to fight battles. The soldiers and sailors and pilots who fought the actual combat were essential, yes, but they were fighting with equipment that factories provided, and the side with more factories and better production would always win given enough time. This was the decisive lesson of industrial warfare in the 20th century, and it was a lesson that Germany had learned too late, after millions of lives had been lost in a conflict whose outcome had been predetermined by manufacturing strength rather than military skill. That was what Kessler understood, standing in an American shipyard in May of 1945, watching America's industrial might at work even as the war in Europe ended and American production began turning its attention to the final defeat of Japan and to the massive reconstruction effort that would follow.